Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I was raised in a house where a lot of things were spoken about indirectly, like you could point at them without naming them and that counted as understanding. My parents weren't cruel. They were practical, tired, and committed to the idea that if you kept moving forward you didn't have to look too closely at what you felt. There was food, school, schedules, the ordinary scaffolding of a life that worked. But there was also an invisible rule: don't create extra complications. Don't become a problem that needs explaining. I learned early that there were categories you were expected to fit into, and that being praised often meant you were blending in well. I also learned, quietly and without anyone teaching me, that I watched people for cues. I watched boys to see how they carried themselves, how they laughed without covering their mouths, how they took up space as if space belonged to them. I watched girls too, not in the way adults assumed boys watched girls, but in a way that felt like studying a language I wasn't allowed to speak. The movements seemed freer, the wardrobe seemed like permission. It wasn't about wanting attention. It was about the feeling that there was a version of being human that looked softer and somehow more honest. My first memories of clothing aren't glamorous. They're domestic. A laundry basket tipped over, socks and t-shirts and towels spilling out like a harmless mess. My mother folding clean clothes on the couch while the television played something she wasn't really watching. A hallway closet with coats, and on the top shelf a box of things that didn't belong to anyone anymore. I remember reaching into that box once, not with a plan, just with curiosity, and pulling out a scarf that smelled like old perfume and dust. It was nothing, really. A piece of fabric. But when I wrapped it around my neck I felt an odd jolt of recognition, as if I'd accidentally put on something that fit a shape I had been keeping hidden even from myself. At that age I didn't have words like identity or gender expression. I didn't think, I want to be a girl, or I want to become someone else. I just thought, this is calming. This is like stepping into a room that's warm when the rest of the house is cold. And I also felt, immediately, the fear of being caught. The fear didn't come from anything my parents had done. It came from the air itself, from the unspoken story all around me about what was acceptable and what was humiliating. I remember hearing the word weird used like a verdict, and I decided I would rather be lonely than be that. So I built a small private life inside my larger life, the way some kids build a fort in the corner of their room. Mine wasn't made of pillows. It was made of secrecy. I learned the sounds of footsteps in the hall. I learned how to fold a scarf back into a box so it looked untouched. I learned to swallow questions before they rose into my throat. And with each year, the part of me that wanted softness and permission didn't go away. It matured into something more complicated, longing mixed with shame, tenderness mixed with the sharp edge of self-policing. When I hit adolescence, everything got louder. Bodies around me were changing, and the social rules tightened. The same boys who had once run around in costumes on Halloween without thinking started to draw lines about what was allowed. They practiced cruelty like it was a sport. It wasn't even always directed at someone specific. Sometimes it was just a way to prove allegiance to the group, a joke about someone's voice, a comment about someone's clothes, laughter at any hint of femininity in a boy. I learned to laugh too, because laughing was camouflage. The laughter, I'd later realize, cost me something. It taught me to betray my own empathy before I had a chance to grow it. I remember one day in school, a drama class where the teacher asked for volunteers to try on costumes from a rack in the corner. There was a wig, an old dress, some hats. Everyone was meant to laugh. It was harmless, the teacher thought. A boy pulled on a dress over his jeans and did an exaggerated walk, hips swinging, hands fluttering. The class erupted. He made it a joke before anyone else could. I laughed with the rest, loud enough to be convincing. But inside I felt a very different sensation, like grief. Not because I wanted to be the center of that laughter, but because I could see how easily something meaningful could be turned into ridicule as a protective maneuver. He was safe because he performed it as clowning. If he had looked comfortable, if he had looked like it mattered, the room would have shifted into danger. That day I went home and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. I didn't hate what I saw, exactly. I just felt disconnected, like I was watching someone I was supposed to be. The boy in the mirror had a face that belonged to me, but it didn't explain the person inside. I think that's when the internal split started to harden into a pattern, one self for the world, one self for the private quiet. It wasn't only about clothing. It was about permission to feel certain emotions. It was about the way I wanted to be spoken to, the way I wanted to speak. It was about the kinds of friendships I craved, deeper and more emotionally honest than the ones I was allowed to admit I wanted. In high school and then college, I made choices that seemed sensible from the outside. I played the role expected of me, studious, reliable, inoffensive. I dated women, because that was part of the script, and because I did genuinely feel attraction and affection. It's important for me to say that plainly. This wasn't a story of pretending to love. My feelings were real. But there was also a quiet bargaining I did with myself. If I do everything else right, maybe this other part will stay small. Maybe it will become irrelevant. Maybe adulthood will fix me, the way people claim it does. It didn't. The private moments continued, but they changed. They became less about curiosity and more about relief. Sometimes, in the late hours of the night when roommates were asleep, I would take something soft from a drawer, something not mine, and hold it for a while like a comfort object. It wasn't about thrill. It was about regulating my own nervous system in a way I didn't understand. When I was anxious, when I felt like the world wanted too much from me, softness was a way to come back to myself. I also became more afraid. Because as you get older, the stakes rise. As a child, being caught might mean a scolding or embarrassment. As an adult, being found out felt like it could dismantle your whole life. I watched stories in the media that treated crossdressing as either a joke or a danger. I listened to casual comments at parties where people laughed at men in dresses, without any awareness that someone standing nearby might be quietly. Much space for introspection. But the truth is that it doesn't fade. It waits. It gathers weight. And when it returns, it doesn't feel like a whim. It feels like hunger for air. The first time I told my wife anything, it came out wrong. Not as a careful conversation, but as an anxious confession that sounded like a crime. We had been married a couple of years. We were folding laundry together, and she held up a soft sweater that didn't belong to me and joked about how comfortable it looked. Something in me tightened, then loosened, then I heard myself say, too quickly, I've worn things like that before. I expected the room to freeze. I expected disgust. I expected the end of something. Instead, she looked at me with the kind of attention that makes you feel both safe and exposed. She didn't laugh. She didn't accuse. She just asked, quietly, what do you mean? Even then I hedged. I made it small. I used vague language. I said it was something I tried sometimes. I said it didn't mean anything. I said I was embarrassed. She listened. She asked questions, not like an interrogator but like someone trying to understand a map. And then she said something that I've carried for years, thank you for telling me. That must have been hard. I wish I could say that moment solved everything, that honesty arrived and stayed. It didn't. The truth is that I was still terrified, and I also didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know whether this was simply a way I soothed myself, or whether it was pointing to a deeper identity question I never allowed myself to ask. I didn't want to make my confusion her burden. I also didn't want to lose her. So I did what I had always done, I tried to manage the situation by controlling information. I told her enough to be truthful but not enough to be vulnerable. And I convinced myself that this was kindness. For a while, it was manageable. We agreed on some basic boundaries, privacy, respect, no secrets that would damage trust. But I still kept parts hidden, not because I wanted to betray her, but because I didn't yet know how to integrate the parts of myself that felt incompatible. I would buy something soft and hide it in a drawer. I would throw it away later in a burst of shame. Then I would buy something again. It was a cycle of relief and self-punishment. And all the while, she watched me, I think, with a kind of quiet worry I didn't want to acknowledge. There's a particular kind of tension that grows when two people love each other but are both afraid of what the truth might demand. It doesn't always erupt into shouting. Sometimes it lives in the pauses. In the way you say you're fine when you're not. In the way you avoid certain topics because you can feel the edge of them. We had that kind of tension for years. We were functional, loving, even joyful at times, but there was also a shadow in our marriage that neither of us wanted to name. I became skilled at doing two contradictory things at once, being a good partner in the visible world, and privately wrestling with questions I wouldn't speak aloud. I read articles late at night about gender expression, about people who crossdressed, about transgender experiences, about mental health and shame. I told myself I was just educating myself. But I also felt the pull of recognition in some of those stories, and that terrified me. Because recognition meant possibility, and possibility meant change, and change meant risking everything I had built. I want to be careful here, because one of the most harmful myths is that exploring femininity as someone assigned male at birth automatically means a predetermined destination. Real life isn't that tidy. For some people, crossdressing is purely expression. For some, it's part of understanding they are transgender. For some, it's fluid. For some, it changes over time. My own experience was messy. I didn't want a label as much as I wanted peace. I wanted to stop feeling like I was constantly monitoring myself. The incident that forced everything into the open wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine. There was no screaming, no dramatic exit, no sudden revelation at a party. It was an ordinary afternoon, and that's part of why it hurt. Ordinary life is where secrets do the most damage, because it's where trust is supposed to live. My wife had asked me to use her laptop to print something while she was out running errands. I rarely used her computer, and I didn't think twice about it. I opened the browser, found the file, and while I was navigating, a tab preview caught my eye. It was a search result page. The words were visible in that half-glance way, the way your brain reads before you decide you didn't mean to. Hormone therapy timeline. Effects of estrogen. Does spouse transition? How to support partner gender exploration. I stared at the screen long enough that my eyes started to hurt, as if pain would make it unreal. At first I thought I had misunderstood. I clicked, then immediately regretted it, but it was too late. There was a trail of searches, not just one. Pages saved. Notes in a document. A list of questions, typed in her careful, organized way. What changes are reversible? What does it mean if it's not sexual? How to talk without pushing. How to protect marriage. How to protect mental health. How to protect him. The last one, the way she wrote at him, made something crack in me, because it reminded me that she still saw me, that she was trying to hold on to the person she had married even while imagining a future where that person might change. I felt dizzy. My first emotion was not gratitude. It was betrayal. Then it was shame. Then it was fear. Then it was something like grief, because I realized she had been carrying this alone, the same way I had. I printed the document she needed. I shut the laptop. I sat at the kitchen table and waited like someone waiting for a diagnosis. In the quiet, my mind ran in circles. Why didn't she tell me? What did she think I was? Was she preparing for me to leave her? Was she hoping I would transition? Was she afraid I would? Had she been watching me, analyzing me? I felt exposed, not because she knew something shameful, but because she knew something intimate before I had spoken it to her. And I also felt, painfully, that she had done this out of love. The mixture of those truths made me feel sick. When she came home, she was talking about grocery store lines and a neighbor she ran into. I tried to respond normally, but my voice sounded thin. She noticed immediately. She asked what was wrong. I could have lied. I could have swallowed it the way I had swallowed everything else. But the secrecy had already done enough damage. So I said, I used your laptop. I saw the searches. Her face changed in a way I will never forget. It wasn't guilt like someone caught doing something wrong. It was fear like someone whose private worry has just been dragged into daylight. She put the grocery bags down slowly, like she needed her hands to do something steady. She said, "You weren't supposed to see that." The phrase stung, even though it was honest. I asked, "Why did you do it? Why didn't you talk to me?" She sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy with years. Then she said, "Because I didn't want to pressure you. Because you looked like you were holding on to something fragile, and I was afraid that if I asked too directly you would collapse or shut down. Because I was scared. Because I didn't know what I was allowed to want." That last sentence landed like a weight. I had been so consumed by my own fear that I hadn't fully considered hers. I had thought of her as the person who might reject me, the person whose reaction I had to manage. I hadn't thought of her as someone with her own desires and grief and hopes inside this situation. I asked her what she meant. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. She said, "I imagined a future where you didn't have to hide. I imagined you feeling lighter. I imagined you being able to express what you keep pressing down. And I don't know what that future looks like. I don't know if it means hormones. I don't know if it means you just have some clothes and you wear them sometimes. I don't know if it means a name you don't tell me. I don't know. But I kept researching because I wanted to be ready to support you if you ever told me you wanted more. And I also researched because I needed to understand what I was afraid of. I needed to picture it so it wouldn't be a monster in my mind." I felt my throat tighten because her words contained both love and a kind of mourning. She wasn't saying it was easy. She was saying she was trying. And then she said, quietly, "I didn't act on any of it. I didn't buy anything. I didn't make appointments. I didn't bring it up. I just held it in my head. I thought maybe you would come to me when you were ready." I realized in that moment that we had been doing the same thing from opposite sides. I had been waiting for permission I didn't know how to ask for. She had been waiting for me to speak so she wouldn't accidentally push me into something or lose me. And in the waiting, we had created a kind of loneliness that lived right in the middle of our marriage. I told her I felt betrayed, and I told her I felt ashamed for feeling betrayed, because she had done nothing malicious. I told her that seeing those searches made me feel like I had been studied, like my private confusion had become a project. She nodded and took it seriously. She didn't defend herself immediately. She said, "I'm sorry. I can see why it would feel like that. I should have talked to you. I just didn't know how." Then she asked me a question that was so simple I almost couldn't answer it. "What do you want?" The truth is that I didn't know. I knew what I had wanted as a child, which was to be safe. I knew what I had wanted as a teenager, which was to not be humiliated. I knew what I had wanted as a young adult, which was to be loved without being discovered. But what did I want now, as a grown person with a spouse and responsibilities and a life built on stability? I sat there and tried to listen beneath the panic. And what I heard, faintly, was not a demand to become someone else overnight. It was a desire to stop living in two halves. It was a desire to have honesty in my own home. It was a desire to explore without self-loathing. It was a desire to treat myself like a human being instead of a problem to solve. So I said, "I want to be able to talk about it without it turning into a crisis. I want to be able to try things without feeling like I'm betraying you. I want to understand whether this is just expression or something deeper, and I don't want to do it alone. And I want to do it responsibly. I don't want to make sudden decisions that would damage our marriage or our mental health." Saying those things out loud felt like stepping into cold water. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. My wife exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for years. She said, "I want that too. I want you to be okay. And I want to be okay. And I want us to stay honest, even if it's messy." That conversation didn't resolve everything. It opened a door, and doors lead to hallways, and hallways can be long. But it changed the texture of our life immediately. The secret wasn't just mine anymore, and it wasn't just hers in the form of silent research. It became something we could look at together, which meant we could stop fighting it in our separate minds. Over the next months, we started to talk in small, careful increments. We made agreements: no rushed medical steps, no hiding purchases, no making promises we couldn't keep. We agreed to check in with each other's emotional capacity, because support has limits and love doesn't magically erase fear. We found a therapist with experience in gender identity and couples work, not because we needed someone to tell us what to do, but because we needed a place where our honesty wouldn't collapse under the weight of our own anxiety. I learned things about myself that I wish I had learned earlier. I learned that shame is not a moral compass. Shame is just the body's memory of social punishment. It can be loud and convincing, but it isn't truth. I learned that secrecy does not protect relationships. It protects fear. It gives fear the steering wheel. I learned that my wife's emotions were not obstacles to my self-understanding, they were part of the reality I had to consider because love is mutual responsibility. I learned that it was possible to explore without erasing my past, without declaring my previous life a lie. My life had been real. My marriage had been real. My struggles had been real. And the way forward would also be real, which meant it would be gradual and sometimes uncomfortable and full of negotiation. I also had to confront the ways I had harmed myself and others by internalizing rigid norms. I remembered the laughter in that drama class, my own voice joining in, and I felt regret that was not performative but clarifying. It taught me that social norms don't just oppress the people who are visibly different, they also trap the people who are trying desperately to appear normal. They teach you to police yourself and, by extension, to police others. Part of my growth was learning to stop participating in that policing, even in subtle ways. At home, we began with something simple. I bought a couple of pieces of clothing that felt affirming without being a costume. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I wanted to start in a way that respected my own nervous system. My wife was present when I ordered them. When they arrived, she asked if I wanted her to be there when I tried them on or if I wanted privacy. That question alone felt like healing, because it acknowledged that this was mine, not her project. I chose a middle ground. I tried them on alone first, then came out and sat with her, fully dressed, heart pounding like I had done something forbidden. She didn't clap. She didn't make it cute. She looked at me and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I can breathe." I also cried, not because I was overwhelmed by joy, but because I was overwhelmed by the loss of all the years I hadn't let myself breathe. Grief and relief can live together. That was another lesson. We talked about pronouns, not as an immediate change but as a question. We talked about names, not as a declaration but as an experiment in imagination. We talked about what it would mean socially, with family, with friends, with work. We didn't rush to tell anyone. We also didn't promise we would never tell anyone. We focused on building internal stability first, because I had learned that identity exploration done in secret can feel like shame, but exploration done without support can feel like chaos. There were hard days. Days when I looked at myself and felt foolish, not because I was doing something wrong but because the old programming was still there, whispering that I was ridiculous. Days when my wife looked tired, not because she didn't love me but because change is exhausting and uncertainty is heavy. Days when we argued about something small and realized it wasn't small at all. We had to practice a kind of emotional honesty that neither of us had been taught, to say, "I'm scared," without turning that fear into blame. At one point, my wife admitted something that startled me. She said, "I was afraid you would never tell me because you didn't trust me. I was afraid I wasn't safe for you." That broke my heart, because it was true in a way. Not because she was unsafe, but because I had been trained to see the whole world as unsafe for this part of me. My secrecy had accidentally communicated mistrust. I apologized, and I meant it. And I also told her, I didn't trust myself. I didn't know what I was. I didn't know what I would become if I stopped holding the line. We kept going anyway, slowly. The work wasn't only about clothing. It was about identity as a larger question. What parts of myself had I amputated to be acceptable? What emotions did I block because they seemed too soft, too vulnerable? What kinds of friendships did I avoid because they might invite questions? What did I define as success, and why? The more I explored, the more I realized that gender expression was connected to a whole network of self-permission. It was like pulling one thread and finding it attached to everything. There came a night, maybe a year after the laptop incident, when we revisited the topic of hormones. Not because we were racing toward a medical decision, but because it had become symbolic. Hormones weren't just a medical topic, they were the line in my mind between "this is a private coping mechanism" and "this is a life-altering truth." My wife admitted that she had imagined me on hormones not because she wanted to change me, but because she wanted to imagine me free. She said, "I pictured you waking up and not flinching at yourself. I pictured you not bracing for the world all the time. And I didn't know if that was fantasy or possible or even what you wanted." I told her the truth I had been afraid to admit, that sometimes I had imagined it too, but the imagination was tangled with fear. I didn't know if I wanted that path, and I didn't want to use hormones as a way to solve emotional pain that needed therapy and support. I didn't want to treat medicine like a shortcut to self-acceptance. I also didn't want to dismiss the possibility out of fear. So we agreed on something that felt both cautious and honest. We would learn, we would talk to professionals if needed, we would move only at the pace that preserved our mental health, and we would not let the fear of other people's opinions dictate our private truth. In practical terms, that meant I started by integrating small expressions into my life without making them a secret performance. Sometimes it was a softer color, a different cut of clothing that still read as ordinary. Sometimes it was skincare, or letting myself enjoy things that had been coded as feminine without apologizing for it. I learned that identity integration is often less about a single dramatic moment and more about 100 small acts of self-respect. I also began to practice a different kind of courage, telling the truth to myself without immediately demanding that the truth become an announcement. There's a pressure in modern narratives to declare a label and then proceed as if the label solves everything. My experience was that labels can be helpful, but they are not the same as understanding. I gave myself permission to be in process. That permission was not an excuse to avoid responsibility, it was a way to avoid cruelty toward myself. Eventually, I told one trusted friend. Not a dramatic coming-out speech, just a careful conversation. I said, "I've been exploring my gender expression. I'm not asking you to fix it. I just want you to know, because I'm trying to live with less hiding." My friend listened and asked respectful questions. They didn't treat it as entertainment. They didn't treat it as a crisis. They said, "I'm glad you told me. I'm here." And I realized how much of my fear was built on anticipating rejection, because rejection had been the loudest story I'd heard. But there were other stories too, quieter ones, where people responded with simple dignity. Not everyone responded well. I want to be honest about that, because realism includes consequences. There were family members I did not tell for a long time because I knew their worldview was rigid. When the topic came up indirectly once, in the form of a news story, I listened to their comments and felt my stomach drop. The casual contempt reminded me that my fear had not been invented. The social pressure was real. But now I had something I didn't have as a child, a home where I wasn't alone. A spouse who knew the truth. A therapist who helped us navigate. A growing ability to choose my boundaries. My wife and I also learned to treat each other with more nuance. She had to grieve certain expectations, and she had to be allowed to do that without being accused of not loving me. I had to own the fact that my fear had created secrecy, and that secrecy had costs. We both had to practice compassion without abandoning honesty. That balance, more than anything, became the foundation of our growth. At some point I realized that the laptop incident, painful as it was, had saved us from a quieter kind of ruin. If we had continued the way we were, each of us holding our private fears and hopes, we would have grown apart while still living under the same roof. We would have become polite strangers, protecting the marriage by starving it of truth. The confrontation forced us to do something braver, to admit desire. Not desire in the simplistic sense, but desire for a life where we could breathe. Desire for a marriage that could hold complexity. Desire for a self that wasn't split into acceptable and unacceptable halves. Today, I can't wrap my story up with a neat bow. I'm still learning. I still have days when I feel the old shame try to reclaim territory. I still live in a world where certain kinds of expression can invite misunderstanding. But I also live in a world where I can speak more honestly than I used to. Where my wife and I have a language for difficult topics. Where I've learned that self-acceptance is not indulgence, it's maintenance. It's a way of staying mentally healthy so I can be present for the people I love. If you're listening to this because parts of it resonate, I want to offer a few reflections I wish someone had offered me earlier. You are not immoral for wanting to understand yourself. Curiosity about your identity is not a betrayal of your family. Secrecy may feel like protection, but it often becomes a prison. If you have a partner, their feelings matter, and your feelings matter too, and the goal is not to win but to build a shared reality where neither of you has to disappear. Seek support that is informed and compassionate. Take your time. Don't make fear your only advisor. And don't confuse shame with truth. Most of all, remember that dignity is not something you earn by being perfect. Dignity is something you practice by being honest, responsible, and kind, even when you're uncertain. I'm still practicing. My wife is too. And in a strange way, the very thing we were most afraid to name has become the place where we've learned the deepest kind of partnership, not the partnership of pretending, but the partnership of facing reality together. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.